Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, delve into the golden age of Islam in a captivating conversation with Dr Shamim Miah, author of Ibn Khaldun, Education, History and Society, and Saeed Khan. Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, this conversation explores the lives and legacies of some key Muslim personalities and their profound influence on the West.
Good morning, everyone, and my name is Professor Saeed Khan, coming in from Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, where I teach Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies, where I'm also the director of the Center for the Study of Citizenship. Lovely to be back in Bradford again for another festival. We have Dr. Shamim Miah, who's certainly far more local than I am, as a senior lecturer at the School of Education at the University of Huddersfield, author of, along with the book that I'll mention, Muslims Schooling in the Question of Self-Segregation, Muslims in the Question of Security, Race, Space, and Multiculturalism in Northern England. He's also the senior fellow at the Center for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies. So the only thing you don't cover is the present? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. But his latest book, which will be available for sale and for signings outside after the session, is Ibn Khaldun, Education, History, and Society. Noteworthy in this is that the foreword for the book is actually by the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim. So good endorsement there for you on the book. The topic of the golden age of Islam, and we'll get to how it is essentially used to define a particular period of time within the 1400-year span of what we sometimes call the Islamicate, the Muslim world writ large. Generally, it's considered to focus on a period of a few hundred years smack in the middle of Islamic history. But I want to pose the question regarding this particular typology. When we think of a golden age, do we think of it as perhaps theologically, or being theologically proximate to the source? Do we look at it as a golden age of culture? Do we look at it as a golden age of empire or expansion, of gaining resources? When I challenge my students who, God bless them and their naivete and having to deal with somebody like me, and I say, okay, you very legitimately and sincerely wanted to be around at the time of the Prophet. But I always ask them two things. I said, it was kind of a rough time. It was actually a time of existential threat. During the Meccan period, you were a marginalized member of society. You were persecuted. You were discriminated. You had to face 3 years of extreme hardship before the opportunity to move to Yathrib or Medina came about. And even then, you had to deal with war, at least 3 major battles against the Meccans, and then, of course, the dislocation and having left everything. And the other thing that I also do, because I'm really just that evil, is I ask the Muslim students when they said, and what guarantee would it be that you would have been Muslim back then? If you are comfortable and if you're a conformist, why not gravitate toward the status quo, which would have been the pagans, the Quraysh? So I get that reflected on my student evaluations at the end that, they bullied me and Khan bullied me and all, and I'm a big boy about that. So you've got that period. You've got the period that you talked about regarding the Caliphal period. Was it golden? I mean, here was a project of Islam that was still trying to get its legs, and it was wobbly. It didn't know if it was going to survive the passing of the Prophet. Within the very first Caliphal period, there was an existential threat with the fragmentation of the Arabian Peninsula, something that the Prophet had worked very hard to try to consolidate. And then you have a period after that, which, of course, is the first big empire of Islam, the Umayyad period. And depending on your denomination or persuasion, it was tumultuous because of the rise of Shi'ism in opposition to what was seen as corrupt political practice among the early caliphs. And then we get to your answer of the Golden Age. Now, of course, Islam is cruising altitude. It's assembled. It is, I mean, as they say in any flight, the most precarious times are the takeoff and the landing. Now you've reached a certain cruising altitude. You might have, of course, a few wobbles of turbulence, but generally you're looking good. But I think it's important to at least unpack that and to consider that when we talk about the Golden Age, it can mean so many different things.
I think you've done a really good job, actually. Yeah.
You're still not done, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. So, I mean, this sister, so what's your name? Shafiqa mentioned that the definition of the Golden Age was slightly after, the death of the Prophet up and including the rightly guided Caliphate. Within historical documentation, that's actually referred to as the Khulafa Rashidun. So that's actually the opinion of Shah Waliullah of Dehlawi, the famous a scholar from India. So that's one leading opinion. But interestingly, he basically says that it includes the first three caliphs. It doesn't necessarily include Ali because Ali was, actually assassinated. So there's some interesting discussions about how the Golden Age is actually kind of defined. Now, if you do a literature review, most of the discussions around the Golden Age focuses on Baghdad, focuses around the Bayt al-Hikmah, which is the famous translation center. And in the Bayt al-Hikmah, you get most of the works of Aristotle translated. You get the works of Plato translated. You get the works of Galen translated. And interestingly, you have some seminal texts from India that's also translated as well. Some of the texts from China also kind of translated as well. So the reason why it's actually a golden period is because of the way in which knowledge is actually defined. So that's the critical point. So it depends upon the way in which you define knowledge in Islam. So, for example, some of the textual theologians will basically say knowledge and the definition of knowledge is confined to revelation. It's confined to the way in which a scholarly community actually apply commentary on the revealed text. Yep. So how we know the world or how we know God is basically confined to the way in which we have a relationship with textual knowledge. But within the Abbasid period in Baghdad, you had the definition of knowledge actually gets expanded. So knowledge is no longer confined to text, but also confined to reason, aql. Yeah. So they basically argue that the way in which you can actually understand God is not only through revelation, but also through philosophy, through mathematics, through science, through logic, etc. So it's different ways in which you can actually make sense and understand God. So that's basically the way in which you define knowledge. But there's also a different way in which the Golden Age has been understood, and that's geographically. So most of the responses to Professor Saeed's question was... Sorry, Saeed.
It's just Saeed.
Yeah. Saeed's question was geographically focused. Yeah. So in other words, around the Middle East. Recent scholarship has basically contested that. So, for example, if you pick up some of the works of Osman Baker, and one book in particular, the title of the book is Beyond Timbuktu, he basically says that, look, most of the way in which we've understood history is very much Arab-centric. Yeah. So we basically say most of, the Golden Age was, restricted to Baghdad, Arabic language, etc. Arabic-speaking, native Arabic-speaking people, etc. So what Osman Baker basically does, he has a different way in which you understand the Muslim world, and he basically does it from the point of view of West Africa. So he looks at Mali, looks at scholarship around Mali, etc. And he basically said, well, it's not just Mali, but you know, it's from the Sahel to you know, as far as Sudan, etc. So he looks at the scholarship around that. And the key question that he basically argued is that why can't this be the golden period, if you like? So there's been, I mean, there's a lot of kind of historians that contest the kind of the Arabic-centric kind of way in which you look at the world. The other thing that actually came out quite interestingly was the timing. I mean, a lot of people actually restricted it to the Mongol invasions. Most people actually talked about, say, for example, you know, the Muslim Spain, etc. Once again, the idea that the golden age of Islam was somehow confined to the past is also being contested by a number of, you know, scholars. So, for example, Saeed Nasser, who specializes on kind of Shia intellectual heritage, his argument is quite straightforward. He basically said, well, when you talk about the golden age of Islam and the end of the golden age of Islam, you're basically talking about Sunni scholarship. You're not necessarily talking about Shia scholarship. So he basically talks about the likes of the Mullah Sadra and various other individuals, which kind of continues the, you know, a period of, you know, golden Islamic scholarship much further on. The book that I'm actually reading at the moment now is this book here, Empires of Salon. And what kind of Helen Pfeiffer is basically doing there is basically saying, well, the golden age of Islam can be pushed way into the Mamluk period. The Mamluk period is an interesting era. I mean, when we get to talk about Ibn Khaldun, we can drill down. But also during the Ottoman period as well. I mean, we know the Ottoman Empire actually, you know, it was well in the 19th, you know, the 19th and the 20th century. So I think there's some interesting scholarship around kind of historians, around people basically that specializing in sociology of knowledge, etc., that try to kind of unsettle the kind of both the geographical kind of centricity of the Golden Age, but also the geographical context as well. I mean, I think the Black Lives Matter was actually pushed us to actually look at the world through different ways, you know, through different lens, etc. So why is it that we're not talking about the Golden Age of Muslims in China? So, for example, if you pick up a book titled The History, Civilization, and Science in China by Joseph Needham, it's a 7-volume text. I think it's about the 3rd or the 4th volume, has a list of Muslim names. So once again, you know, when we talk about the Golden Age, we don't, you know, it's not restricted to Baghdad, it's not restricted to Africa, it's not restricted to kind of southern Spain, but, you know, there's a lot of Chinese legacy there as well. I mean, I had the fortune to do a little bit of traveling around China back in 2000, 2001. I mean, the Islam in China goes all the way back to Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, the maternal, you know, the uncle of the Prophet. So there's a rich intellectual, you know, heritage there in China that's there for, you know, sociologists, historians, to kind of reconfigure the way in which we kind of actually look at the world. And I think it's a really interesting period, you know, for us to kind of explore the way in which, you know, the golden age is actually kind of defined.
So, I mean, this point and the point that you were making, ma'am, about the 2 A's that are known to, really, I think, to the Western world, perhaps more so than other Muslim intellectuals. Averroes, of course, being in Cordoba, being a contemporary, at least for a little while, with Moses Maimonides, etc. By the way, Averroes and Avicenna are the only 2 Muslims not consigned to Inferno in Dante's Divine Comedy. He perhaps begrudgingly puts them in Purgatorio, the book that I think is least read out of the three. Everybody reads Inferno to the point where the pages almost fall out, and then they read Paradiso, and I think Purgatorio is, they kind of keep it in limbo.
Just to add that Ibn Rushd is also included in Raphael's paintings of the School of Athens.
The School of Athens, exactly, at the Vatican Museum. Everyone goes straight to the Sistine Chapel.
No, I went straight to the Vatican Museum.
I get there and go straight to the Louvre, but okay.
So you mentioned Averroes. When you look at the painting, he's actually overlooking Aristotle.
No,
sorry, no, it's not Aristotle. I do apologize.
It's Pythagoras.
Yeah, Pythagoras. Do apologize. Yeah. Because
Aristotle and Plato
are at the center.
Yeah, they're walking down the middle. Yeah. So you can tell we spent some time at that looking at that painting, and then right across from it is the School of Religion.
Yes.
The two really massive portraits. So, yeah, who needs a Mona Lisa? Who needs the Sistine Chapel? And just go stare at those. But the idea of, and I think you're alluding to this, the erasure of so many intellectuals, Al-Biruni, Al-Razi, Al-Khwarizmi, who, to the bane of some of our existence, gave us algebra, and so many other scholars and scientists. Thomas Kuhn, the famous historian of science, who gave us the notion of the paradigm shift, has pretty much dismissed Muslim contribution, almost to act as though Western knowledge came about ex nihilo. I mean, there was almost like a Big Bang theory of Western knowledge. And what are the then both psychological and historical and cultural consequences of leaving that out? I thought that was rather interesting. And also the idea that today knowledge is an intellectual property. It's commodified. It has monetary value. Back then, no one thought about it. It was, in today's terms, freeware. So can we ever look at knowledge the same way again in knowledge production?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, just before we get there, I mean, that's really interesting, especially now when you've got kind of commercialization of knowledge, etc. I mean, when people actually go to university or do the GCSE or A-level, it's education has an economic transaction. I mean, the first question that we asked, someone that's doing their GCSE is, what do you want to do? What courses do you want to do at universities? What do you want to be? It's almost kind of a neoliberal kind of association, with knowledge and knowledge production. But having said that, within the West, there's also that kind of the liberal model of learning as well. The liberal arts colleges, etc., that basically put emphasis on knowledge for the sake of knowledge, knowledge production for the sake of knowledge. So there's some kind of elements there as well. But I think, I mean, I'm really interested in the way in which knowledge is actually produced outside the academy. Yeah. So I mean, this book's really interesting because it talks about knowledge productions within salons. I mean, you've got the inventions of coffee during the Ottoman period, and you've got knowledge production within coffee shops, like Jean-Paul Sartre and various other individuals. I mean, knowledge production, it happens over sipping coffee and, a discussion, etc. And then you actually pick up this book by, I forget the first name, the surname is Rosen. The title of the book is The Intellectual Lives of the English Working Class. Really interesting book. It's a big doorstopper. And he basically talks about knowledge production amongst the working class men and women, and that's actually happening within factories, learned societies, etc. And people who don't necessarily go to schools and colleges, spending their kind of wages trying to build their own personal libraries, etc. So I think there's another way of looking at knowledge when you kind of minus out the kind of university establishment. you know, libraries and you know, working men's clubs, etc. There's different ways in which, you know, knowledge production actually happens. I mean, I'll give you a really interesting example. I did an academic paper in I think it was Dublin. No, it wasn't Dublin. God Almighty. Oh, anyway, some part of Ireland. Yeah, and after,
as you can tell, he has a lot of respect for Ireland.
yeah, yeah, and the session finished, and they said, "Well, we can give you, you know, like a guided tour of, you know, of Ireland." So I said, "Okay, let's." It's a nice little culture, little trip. So I went on, and you had a professor, a history professor, talking about, you know, different parts of Ireland, etc. And he was put right by the coach driver. He says, "No, that's not right. Yeah, this happened here. Yes, but I mean, what about this perspective? What about that perspective? Yeah." So it's really interesting how, you know, I mean, the thing that I actually got from that is the way in which, you know, knowledge production doesn't only happen within the confines of the university. Knowledge production can actually happen outside the academy. And this is basically where the Muslim world actually focused. I mean, this is where, I mean, just coming back to Ibn Khaldun, he basically talks about knowledge production where you kind of invest yourself within a one-to-one relationship with a teacher. So knowledge production doesn't actually happen through schooling, because he basically talks about that schooling system becomes highly politicized. And you basically have history taught that basically suits the political objectives of the leading caliph or the leading rulers, etc. So he goes, in order for you to actually, you know, tap into knowledge, you have to do it outside the kind of, you know, organized and bureaucratical structures. It's about learning the text, but, you know, doing it one-to-one with a scholar. So it's a really interesting way. It's a different way in which kind of knowledge production and how knowledge actually kind of operates.
Well, I mean, I think this brings up a really interesting point about how adaptive should we be to move out of certain structures. I mean, one of the things I find certainly in British culture is the role of the pub for having those kind. I mean, it is literally the salon of Britain compared to the cafe on the left bank of the Seine. You know, I know that's my really horrid French accent, but you know, it is the French. Sorry, but the idea that especially with social media and having come off COVID, where those kinds of spaces are. Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher, talks about, of course, the structural transformation of the public sphere, and how critical that is. So something to keep in mind, that where knowledge production will be may be different than how we see it today. But before we get into really your excellent book on Ibn Khaldun, we've been talking here about the golden age of Islam, looking at it being somewhere around, now we've expanded it beyond 800 to 1200, if you'll permit, to somewhere between 700 and 1500. We've been talking about it almost strictly through the lens of cultural or knowledge production. Do we shortchange the definition of golden age by essentializing it as knowledge? Because this is a period also that was defined by a tremendous amount of pluralism. This was an area and an era of synergy. The fact that you had somebody like, say, Hasdai bin Shaprut, who was a member of the Jewish community of Cordoba, serving as the head of the Customs and Excise Office in that city, people who were viziers to the Ottoman court. And everywhere you went in the so-called Muslim world, you saw this spirit of pluralism, which I think contributed to knowledge production.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, what most readers don't actually understand is that if you look at Baghdad as the golden age, and you say, well, why was it the golden age? Well, golden age was actually produced by the Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, where most of the knowledge of non-Muslim world was actually translated, you know, from Greek, from China, from India, etc. Well, the thing question is that who translated these? It wasn't Muslims. It was the likes of Gerald of Cremona. Yeah, so these people, or Hunayn ibn Ishaq. So these were kind of Syrian Christians that had the language of Greek, a language, Latin. They had disposal to Latin, etc. So they were able to actually translate these works. So even at that time, knowledge production, even if you, I take your point. Even if you disregard regard knowledge, you still have this interaction of Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu intellectuals kind of exchanging kind of ideas, if you like, based upon the premise that the Muslims basically said, well, this is knowledge because all knowledge comes from God. Yeah. All knowledge comes from God. So even because Galen invented, aspects to do with like medicine, or Pythagoras with mathematics, or Aristotle with philosophy, etc. Their argument was the ultimate source of that is Allah.
Yeah. I mean, coming from say the zero coming from sort of polytheistic India is not a disqualifier.
Yeah.
I think is a really important thing. Well, it also speaks to this idea that at that time, the knowledge production was attributed to the zeitgeist, and the zeitgeist, of course, was Islam. So even Maimonides, his incredible contributions, while certainly and rightly claimed by the Jewish community, still falls within the metastructure of he was operating within Islamic civilization, and conversely. Muslim contributions today are under the zeitgeist of Western civilization. For example, the two Turkish scientists who came up with the COVID vaccine. Muslim, yes, but they will be seen under a tent with a different flag.
Yeah.
So to speak.
Yeah.
So tell us about Ibn Khaldun.
Yeah.
I mean, who certainly had an interest in studying societies.
Yeah. So just before we get, because I think you alluded to a really fascinating point. I think when we talk about knowledge production, that basically means different ways in which you look at the world. So, for example, if you look at the Crusades, look at the history around Crusades, how is that defined? It's ultimately defined as between a clash between, say, for example, Islamdom and Christendom. Yeah, if you pick up any history book. But if you look at the history books as produced by the Muslims and their understanding of the Crusade, it wasn't focused on the clash of Christianity and Islam. The way they actually looked at it was through the perspective of Christians coming from one geographical location, i.e. Western Europe. Yeah. So when they came into Syria, Damascus, Jerusalem, etc., they also massacred Christians as well. So when they were writing history, when they were looking at the world, they weren't necessarily looking at it from this point of view of the clash of civilizations, if you like. But it was slightly much more kind of nuanced, if you like. Yeah. So I think when we talk about knowledge, when we talk about knowledge production, I think that gives us a really fascinating insight. Because, I mean, when we talk about, say, for example, the West and science, I mean, I'm really interested in looking at, say, for example, contemporary politics or contemporary issues about knowledge, etc., from a different civilizational vantage point. So I'm not even saying, well, how do Muslims actually look at it? But I mean, how did the Chinese civilization actually look at it? And that's why Joseph Needham's writing is really fascinating, because he comes from an Oxbridge don, falls in love with the Chinese women, goes and spends all of his life in China, translates this kind of magnus opus, and it gives you a really fascinating insight into the way in which knowledge, science is actually perceived from Chinese civilizational point of view. And I think that needs, I mean, we talk about multiculturalism, etc. I think this way of understanding the world through a different lens, I think that needs to be kind of encouraged, if you like. And this is why, just to segue into Ibn Khaldun. And I think Ibn Khaldun's work actually allows us to do that. So we talk greatly about kind of history. I mean, Ibn Khaldun wasn't writing at that golden age of the Abbasid Empire. Yeah, he was writing more or less the latter part of the 1300, early part of the 1400. Yeah, he was writing at a time when the Muslim world was very tumultuous. There's one empire that was actually falling, the other was actually rising. Yeah, so he was kind of really interesting period of North Africa that he was actually living through. But Ibn Khaldun was a jurist. He was a Maliki jurist. He was a Islamic scholar, memorized the text, most of the classical text, at a very early age. It came from a very influential royal kind of family stock, if you like, that became famous in Andalusia, but with the Christian Reconquista, he had to kind of flee southern Spain and spend most of his time in Tunisia, in Cairo, in Fez, in Morocco, etc. But so he is an interesting individual because he embodies that kind of a tradition that basically embodies the Islamic learning with scientific learning, with historical learning, as a historian. So, I mean, I'm not a historian, as you may have kind of actually picked up. I mean, I'm a sociologist. The thing that I find fascinating about Ibn Khaldun, when he was actually writing, is that he looked at it from his own kind of, his own upbringing, his experience as a political advisor to a number of kind of a famous Muslim rulers. He basically said to himself, well, there isn't any science or a academic discipline that allows me to actually make sense of my experience. So he basically created his own science, yeah? And that science was sociology. Well before, we have, sociology developed by Auguste Comte, much later on.
Or Durkheim or
yeah.
Weber.
Yeah, so that's why I think Ibn Khaldun is really interesting. And this is the challenge for us, I'm speaking as a Muslim here, is that we need to actually create new sciences. When we talk about the Islamization of knowledge, I mean, that epistemologically, that's a flawed idea. We need to recreate new ideas, new ways in which we can actually make sense of the complex reality that we are actually kind of living in. So that's why I think Ibn Khaldun is really, really fascinating. But equally speaking, it's fascinating because the way in which the Muslim world doesn't actually take up his writing, with the exception of, say, for example, the Ottoman Empire. But it becomes the French intellectuals that basically translate his writing. And the reason why it's the French intellectuals is because they want, colonial interest over North Africa. They want to know, the history, sociology, politics, and all the dynamics, etc. So that's why I think it's really fascinating because Ibn Khaldun is perhaps one of the many scholars that is talked a lot. Works have been translated. I mean, I can say when I was writing this book, I had access to all books that was written on Ibn Khaldun. I said to myself, well, I'm going to try and read all the journals, but it's just too much. It's not hundreds, you're talking thousands of journals, yeah? And it's not just his writings on history, education, society, economics as well. I mean, you have Boris Johnson quotes Ibn Khaldun from his Muqaddimah twice.
That went real well.
Yeah. Ronald Reagan quotes him once, yeah. And then you have Mark Zuckerberg, 2015, he identifies, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah as the book of the year that is basic reading. So it's interesting how people from the West have taken a great liking to Ibn Khaldun's writing.
Well, I mean, I think this idea of and would you say are you happy with the Franz Rosenthal and J. Dawood translation?
So the French, yeah, that's really interesting. So if you read, say, for example, George Makdisi is a famous Christian Arab, but I think later on, from my reading, I think he converts to Islam. He basically criticizes the Rosenthal translation for two reasons. He basically says that Rosenthal didn't have access to classical Arabic, and neither did he understand the social history of North Africa.
Yeah, but didn't he need to read the book in order to understand the social history.
Yeah. So I mean, so George Makdisi is quite critical. The N.J. Dawood is actually abridgment, so it's not a new translation.
Right.
It's like an abridgment. But the thing about the N.J. Dawood that I don't like is because he basically rips out the Islamic soul out of the Muqaddimah. Yeah. So you know when you're editing a certain text, you have a certain license of which chunks that you include, which chunks that you don't include. So N.J. Dawood, he basically takes out any references to say, for example, Islamic piety or Muslim piety. And that fits in with a certain tradition of looking at Ibn Khaldun, because there's three ways in which Ibn Khaldun's scholarship is looked at. The first group of scholars that basically say that Ibn Khaldun was ultimately a secular scholar within the same tradition as Aristotle and various other individuals. Yeah. So Mohsin Mendi, the famous the philosopher, basically says, well, Ibn Khaldun is Aristotelian. That's basically the intellectual kind of a heritage and tradition that is actually working from. Then there's another group of scholars that basically say, well, if you read the Muqaddimah, so if you stick to the first group, they basically say, well, if you look at the key concepts that Ibn Khaldun is playing with, Asabiyya, looking at history, etc., these are not Islamic terminologies. To say that Ibn Khaldun was Islamic is fundamentally flawed, because he's actually using conceptual frameworks that's not available within, within kind of the Islamic kind of vocabulary, if you like, because he's recreating new language and new vocabularies. Then the second group basically says, no, well, you have to understand where Ibn Khaldun comes from, looking at his education, looking at his own kind of biographical kind of history, if you like. It's very difficult to actually separate his, a secular understanding of the world with his Islamic kind of upbringing. So that's the second a school of thought. And the third school of thought basically says, well, you needed to look at Ibn Khaldun right at the end of his career, not necessarily his beginning, but most right at the end. And they basically say, well, no, he was atypical of Muslim intellectuals at that time, that were able to actually kind of marriage both their kind of secular understanding of the world with Islamic piety, but also a strong grounding in Sufism as well, tasawwuf. So I think the third way in which Ibn Khaldun is actually studied is much more kind of contemporaneous. It's much more where most of the kind of contemporary kind of scholars of Ibn Khaldun actually fall.
Yeah, I find this idea about secularization of scholarship to be fascinating, because N.J. Dawood stripping and divorcing Ibn Khaldun's religious orientation and his lens. We wouldn't go ahead and do that with Marx. I mean, for Karl Marx, his atheism is very much part of Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. No one would think about saying, oh, well, let's go ahead and try to read him without that. I mean, it's really central. And what you're saying is, for people like Ibn Khaldun, people like Averroes, people like Avicenna, that it needs to be read into it. So I think that's a really important to think about it. And this process, I think, is happening in the Islamicate. I remember when Muhammad Ali died, the boxer, there was this idea of who's going to claim him. The Black American community certainly went ahead and did it. Muhammad Ali, the global citizen, everyone trying to claim him, but really trying to write out his Islamic identity from that. The other point I thought that was really important that you raised was this idea about disciplines, not discipline, but scholarly disciplines, and the problematics with placing these boxes and saying sociology. So Ibn Khaldun is known as the father of modern sociology, but sociology, as we understand it, is profoundly different. I remember hearing, actually from up here in the north, the scholar Brian Turner defining anthropology as a mechanism created to study and then control the colonized. And sociology, in his estimation, was created to first study and control the classes. And I'm not sure if that's how Ibn Khaldun would define the latter. So then how do we read Ibn Khaldun in his fullest? And how do we then understand the golden age of Islam in its fullest? if we have to acknowledge these systemic issues?
No, it's really interesting. I think the first legacy of Ibn Khaldun, if you like, a contribution that outlives him, is perhaps the way in which he looks at history. So he doesn't look at history as a study of the past, but rather he sees history as philosophy. So he basically says, well, in order for us to understand history, we need to take a step back and not look at events, not look at individuals, not look at kind of power struggle, etc., but rather to say that what does history actually symbolize? What does it mean? What are the overarching kind of categories that we can actually kind of draw from that? So, for example, you apply the Khaldunian logic to history now. You look at contemporary history, look at Donald Trump, look at Boris Johnson, and when you pick up books from Waterstones and various other places, it's all about biographical. It's to do with like key characters, key players. What Ibn Khaldun would basically say, well, what we need to do is take a step back and draw out philosophical learnings. What is it that this period basically tells us? Yeah. What is it about these moments of history? So for Ibn Khaldun, for history isn't necessarily looking at characters, looking at events, but looking at philosophy. What are the overarching ideas that we can actually kind of glean from that? So I think that's probably one of the many things, one of the many legacies that Ibn Khaldun talks about, his contribution. The other thing I think Ibn Khaldun I find fascinating is that he doesn't actually look at history as a linear process. It's not history doesn't actually work from a Comtean logic, as August Comte.
Like what Hegel gave to us. Yes.
About dialectic. So for Ibn Khaldun, he basically talks about this idea of cyclical knowledge. That certain ideas that basically will come back into fashion. So look at history as repeated events, cycles. So when you understand history as philosophy, you're able to actually see and map out the rise and falls of civilizations. You're able to actually understand history through a philosophical lens. So using the same logic, Ibn Khaldun will basically say, history isn't the study of the past, but history is a study of the present. Because you can't actually understand the present without actually looking at the past. So, I'm just looking at here, there's people from the Indian subcontinent, from Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Turkey, I'm sure you've got local people, etc. So even if when you look at this room, you can't actually make sense of this room without actually understanding the past. So Ibn Khaldun says, in order for you to understand the present, you got to understand the past. But it doesn't stay there. Yeah, so it's not understanding the past to make sense of the present, because you have to understand the present and in order to understand the future as well. Yeah, so I think this is where a non-linear way of looking at time, non-linear way of looking at history is really fascinating. In the weekend, I was at like a residential retreat for some youth workers that basically want to actually do some good work in Oldham. So they asked me to spend a day with them. So I said, okay, it was a nice little retreat. So I tried to kind of instill kind of Ibn Khaldun's kind of visioning, if you like. So I said, look, when you're thinking about community development of youth work, etc., Ibn Khaldun will basically say, you've got to think about it in generational terms. It's not about what can we do today, in 1 year's time, in 2 years' time, but Khaldunian logic will be what can we do about in terms of a generational. Yeah. So, for example, if you take the LGBTQ agenda, etc., although we're having a discussion about it now, but this started back in the 80s, when activists actually kind of got together, etc. So you do have certain kind of activists that basically don't necessarily think about agendas and ideas within like 1 year cycles or 2 year cycles. It's almost kind of generational kind of cycles if you think about it. So I think this is why reviving a Khalduni way of understanding the world, I think is really fascinating.
Yeah. No, and I think you delineated that really well. So for those of you who took your history GCSEs already, take comfort that you're not going to have a revamp in case you get involved in that. Second of all, I've never actually heard the words philosophical, Trump and Boris Johnson in the same sentence. And finally, just think of China and perhaps what might behoove us with China's ascent to think about time in different segments as the way we do. We have a few minutes for questions, if any of you have. Yes, in the back. Okay. We got a mic coming around.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum. I really enjoyed the speech that both of you did today. So I do have 2 questions, if that's okay. I'll try to make them quick. The first question is regarding the caliphate. I would argue that there's sort of like a golden age of economic and social justice. So for example, Umar bin Khattab, radiallahu anhu, you know, when he went to conquer Jerusalem, he found out that the Jewish people were being persecuted. So he got in 80 Jewish families. He established the Bayt al-Mal, so there was a mix of capitalism and socialism. And so this is my first question. Do you think that the Khulafa Rashidun had sort of a golden age in terms of economics and social justice?
Well, I think that was actually something that was discussed earlier, that number one, someone did find the caliphal period to be the golden age. And second of all, really when we think of this term golden age, it is a contested one, that people will, depending on the metrics that they want to privilege and give primacy to, consider different eras of Islamic history to be the golden age.
Yeah. And my second question is, you know, the early Muslim golden age scientists, they would argue that there's 2 sources of science. So one is the Quran and one is the universe itself, so nature. And do you think that nowadays people have abandoned this in search of science? So the Muslims in general, they might have like looked at the Quran, but they're not looking at nature itself.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. Yeah. So a number of contemporary philosophers, they basically question the separating of social sciences from the natural sciences. So in most universities that you actually go, so you have a department of science, you have a department of social science, and you have a department of humanities. So these are distinct ways in which you understand the world. So the likes of Zia Sada and various other people basically say, look, what we need to do is to kind of challenge and contest these kind of Western ways in which we actually view the world through kind of binary, kind of opposites, if you like. And what he's basically arguing is that if you look at economics, you can't actually have economics without ethics. Otherwise, you have capitalism. You know, you can't separate the two. You can't actually have science, so for example, genetic modifications, without ethics. So I think you've alluded to a really important point in the way in which we view the world not necessarily through the kind of binary distinctions, but rather we kind of amalgamate the way in which we look at the world in a much more kind of holistic way. There are going to be contradictions that actually arise from that, but it's how we manage those kind of contradictions in a very kind of, in a creative way, so to speak. Yeah.
Especially with AI changing things. Time for one more question. Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I was just thinking about the reasons for the loss of the Golden Age. We'll never be dated, but certainly by 15th century. And I know there's wider political events happening that have contributed to this decline. But do you also think that the dominance of, I think the word is taqlid, this blind following, particularly associated with the mazhabs, which seems to become dominant. I mean, it had a long history, but becomes dominant after maybe the death of Ibn Arabi, which has stultified intellection within the Muslim world, and I still find it today. Do you think that was a factor?
Yeah. I think if you certainly look at the literature, I mean, the argument is that is a factor. I mean, ultimately, people actually blame Imam al-Ghazali for it, to say that he closed the gates of ijtihad, etc. But I think that, I mean, what I've tried to do earlier on is to try and challenge that. There's looking at different parts of the way. I mean, if you look at it from one geographical vantage point, then you can actually say, taqlid is an issue. But if you look at it from, say, for example, history of Islam from Southeast Asia, like Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., you have a completely different way in which you kind of understand Islamic history. So I think it's where you actually start from. I mean, I would really welcome, a history department somewhere that basically starts to look at the history of Islam not starting off from, like, say, for example, the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasids, etc., but rather from West Africa. You know, I think it'll be a really fascinating way in which you actually view the world. Or, say, for example, from India. I think we need to kind of perhaps deconstruct the importance of geography and privilege and how that skews the way in which we actually view the world. I mean, just as a side note, I mean, I did sociology as my undergraduate, master's, and a PhD and what have you. It was only much later on that I came across the works of W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, how is that possible? How can I go through an entire university system and not necessarily come across the writings of Du Bois? I mean, he's a black, a sociologist. And how can I go all the way through from an undergraduate to a master's, a PhD, and study Durkheim in great detail and miss the fact that Durkheim was supervising Taha Hussein, whose PhD thesis was on Ibn Khaldun. So I think it's really, I mean, we almost have to kind of read history against the grain, if you like, to actually kind of identify and pick some of these things up. Yeah.
I mean, I would argue in part it has to do with losing the zeitgeist. Muslim production of knowledge is still going on unabated. At the same time, I think that because of the loss of zeitgeist, the primary push for producing knowledge seems to be to keep Muslims having to assert their relevance, whereas before it was not a question about having to prove their relevance, it was self-evident. So I think that's an important thing. First of all, thank you for being here. The book is Ibn Khaldun, Education, History, and Society by Shamim Miah, who will be outside both signing copies, which I hope you will purchase. Thank you, Shamim. I mean, as always, it's nice to be in person instead of on a screen on Islam Channel or something. Thank you for being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. It's the last day of the festival, so hopefully you'll get as many of the sessions in as possible. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to everyone who attended our 2024 Bradford Literature Festival and helped to make it such a success. You'll be able to listen back to some of our selected events in the new series, coming soon.